It was not the sound that made Secret Service agent James Rowley freeze, but the silence that came after. A stillness unlike anything he had ever known swept across Dealey Plaza, as if time itself had paused to witness what had just unfolded. The President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, had been waving, smiling, nodding to the sea of hopeful faces gathered to see him pass by in his open-top limousine just seconds before. At that precise moment, the sun glinted off his perfectly combed hair. His eyes seemed to reflect nothing but peace and promise, a future untarnished by fear or war. And then everything shattered. A sharp echo broke the moment, like glass splintering in the wind, and the world tilted violently into chaos. The shot came from somewhere behind him, at least that is what they said. But no one really knew, not then, and not even now. The people screamed, the air shook, the cameras turned, and the president slumped, his head rocked violently, and blood sprayed across the pristine white leather of the vehicle. Jacqueline Kennedy leaned in, her face frozen in horror, her hands trembling, her lips moving as if to pray, but no words came. The driver accelerated, then hesitated, then accelerated again, as if he too could not understand whether he was in a dream or a waking nightmare. Rowley reached for his earpiece, but all he heard was static and then screaming from every direction, agents shouting, people running, children crying, and somewhere far behind them, the sound of one more shot, not as loud this time, but final and full of certainty. One of the agents swore he saw smoke coming from the grassy knoll. Another said he saw a glint of something metal on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. No one knew who was right, because by the time the smoke cleared, the man who had really pulled the trigger had already vanished. He was not in any report. He was not in any interview. He had no name, no face, no trace. Not even the bullet casing was. His rifle was untraceable. His gloves left no fingerprints, and his escape route was planned down to the second. He had entered the building through a service door reserved for employees, walked up a back stairwell, bypassed 2 custodians who did not even glance at him, and set up his weapon behind a stack of boxes like a ghost rehearsing his final performance. His posture was military, his breath calm, his hands steady, as if he had done this before, not once but many times. There were whispers later about a man with the look of a soldier, but no one could describe his face clearly. Some said he wore a cap. Others said his eyes were gray, or maybe blue, or maybe green. Memory had already begun to betray them. But one man remembered more than he should have, and that was Ernie Bishop, the night janitor at the depository. He was on shift the night before the assassination, and he saw the man enter just past midnight. Ernie was a quiet man, a father of 3, a lover of jazz, music, and crossword puzzles. He kept his head down, worked his hours, and never asked too many questions. But that night something felt off. He said the man walked like he owned the place and carried a long bag that did not look like a mop or cleaning tools. Ernie asked him what he was doing there, and the man smiled, but said nothing, just nodded once, and continued walking into the darkness. Something about that silence chilled Ernie to the bone. The next morning, Ernie told his neighbor, a retired librarian named Mrs. Delacroix, that he was going to report it. He said he had seen someone that should not have been there, someone dangerous. Mrs. Delacroix said he seemed shaken, even frightened, but determined. He never got the chance to tell anyone else. That same night, Ernie Bishop was found in his apartment dead from a single gunshot wound to the head. His death was ruled a suicide, but the gun was found in his left hand even though he was right-handed, and there were no powder burns on his fingers. No one questioned it further. His body was buried with a modest ceremony, and the story faded into the fog of all the other strange things that happened that week. But the truth did not fade. It lingered like smoke in the corners of memory and suspicion. Years later, an old photograph was found tucked inside a forgotten file at the Dallas Police Department. It showed a man walking into the back of the depository at midnight the night before the assassination. The figure was blurry, the shadows deep, but the posture was unmistakable, upright, calm, lethal. Some say that photograph disappeared within days of its discovery. taken by a man in a dark suit who showed no badge but carried a government-level clearance. Others say it was never real at all, that it was just another ghost story in a forest of lies. But then came the phone call, the one no one traced, the one that rang in the middle of the night in a Pentagon office where only 4 men had access. Voice whispered into the receiver, the words short and cold, "Phase 1 is complete," and then the line went dead. What was Phase 1? No one ever knew officially. Unofficially, it meant the death of a man who had become too dangerous, not because of what he had done, but because of what he planned to do. Kennedy had spoken of dismantling the CIA, of withdrawing from Vietnam, of exposing secrets that had lived in the dark for too long. Some said he had even found out about something deeper, something older, a network within the government that operated above the law, above the Constitution, above the will of the people. He wanted to shine a light on it, and they could not let that happen. And so the trap was laid not just for him, but for the country itself. The security that day was strangely loose. Agents were reassigned, routes were changed, warnings were ignored. A man arrested weeks earlier for threatening the president was quietly released with no explanation. And in the final days leading up to Dallas, the mood in the White House shifted. Kennedy joked often about death, about being a target, as if he felt it coming. Jacqueline later said he had dreams about being shot in a crowd, about blood and silence and unfinished speeches. And so was that the president died not from one bullet, but from a conspiracy so perfect it wore the face of coincidence, the perfect cover, the perfect fall guy, the perfect silence. But no murder, no matter how flawless, can stay hidden forever, and the first crack in the story came not from a general or an agent or a reporter, but from a janitor, a man who cleaned floors and emptied trash but who saw what others ignored, a man whose silence was bought with a bullet, but whose truth still haunts the corners of Dealey Plaza. The question remains not just who pulled the trigger, but why, who ordered it, who planned it, who erased the truth and replaced it with a myth that millions still believe. The answer begins here, in the final smile of a president, the shattering of peace in a single shot, and the vanishing figure who walked away before history could catch his name. There was always something wrong about Agent Harold Stryker. He never spoke more than necessary, never laughed, never blinked more than a machine should, and never arrived before a tragedy. Only after, when the smoke cleared, he was there. When the tapes went missing, he was there. When people forgot what they had just seen, he was already one step ahead of their memory. Stryker was not a name that echoed through history books, nor was it whispered in testimony, but he was always present like a ghost. In the footnotes of tragedy, his official file said retired intelligence, but the unofficial ones spoke of darker things, of rooms without windows and missions without names. After the death of President Kennedy, Stryker boarded a private jet bound for Dallas with no visible badge and no manifest. He arrived not to grieve, not to mourn, but to begin the cleanup. He moved like a shadow through the Dallas Police Department, a man whose clearance outstripped the chief himself and whose presence made even seasoned officers fall silent. He carried a silver briefcase which he never opened in public, and spoke only into a small device wired directly to an earpiece that fed information to a command post no one could locate. He was part of an off-books intelligence team known as Blue Ash, a program so deeply buried in black budget reports that even the vice president may not have known its full reach. Blue Ash was not designed for defense or diplomacy. It was not even designed for war. It was built for silence, for deletion, for erasure. They were the government solution to impossible problems, the ones that could not be solved by law or reason or force. They erased memories, buried scandals, rewrote timelines. Their job was not to protect the truth, but to maintain the illusion that the truth had already been told. And Stryker was their finest weapon. The morning after the assassination, Stryker visited the Texas School Book Depository, not to examine evidence, but to remove it. He entered through the back at dawn while police were still trying to determine what had happened. He spoke to no one. He did not show a badge. He simply walked past yellow tape like it did not exist. Within the hour, several files disappeared. From the evidence room, including a maintenance log that mentioned a strange visitor the night before, and an audio tape from a nearby diner that may have captured voices. Speaking of gunshots just seconds before they happened, Stryker then paid a visit to the local television station where two reporters had been working on a story about a janitor named Ernie Bishop who had claimed to see a man inside the building the night before the assassination. Those reporters were Marie Dalton and Greg Summers. On the evening of November 23rd, just one day after Kennedy was shot, Marie and Greg were driving home from the station when their car swerved off the road and exploded upon impact with a tree. The official report blamed faulty brakes, but witnesses said they saw another car trailing them moments before the crash. A black vehicle with tinted windows and no license plates. What the public did not know was that Marie had sent a copy of her notes to her sister in New Orleans the day before the crash, a detailed account of what Ernie Bishop had told her and Greg. Description of a man with military posture, a long black case, and no intention of being seen. Those notes never arrived. The envelope was intercepted, and the courier was found unconscious in a bus terminal hours later. His bag missing, and no memory of what had happened. Stryker was not questioned. He left Dallas 2 days later and returned to Washington, where he filed no reports, gave no interviews, and disappeared once again into the shadows. But something remained: a single photograph, taken by a tourist on the grassy knoll just minutes after the shots were fired. In the background was a man with a crew cut wearing gloves standing near the picket fence. His hands were not empty but cradling something too thin to be a rifle and too long to be a radio. Those who studied the image called it a prototype weapon, one that used compressed gas to fire small projectiles with deadly force. It was a weapon the military never admitted to owning, but one that appeared again years later in foreign conflict zones, in the hands of men who did not exist on any roster. Photograph was quietly buried. It was never released to the public, never shown. During the Warren Commission hearings, it was said to have been lost, but a copy remained in the possession of a private investigator named Julian Marks, who had once worked for the FBI but had grown disillusioned and started asking questions he should not have asked. Marks claimed the weapon in the photograph matched a design he had seen during a classified assignment in Panama. Years before, he believed Stryker was not just covering up the assassination, but that he may have been one of the shooters himself. Marks shared his theory with a few close contacts, all of whom told him to drop it. One of them, a former CIA analyst, told him bluntly that chasing shadows would only lead to darkness. Weeks later, Marks disappeared from his home in Virginia. His apartment was untouched, his car still in the driveway, and his phone showed no outgoing calls. Only a single note remained typed in block letters and taped to his bedroom mirror. It reads, "Silence is survival." The case was closed without investigation. Stryker, meanwhile, was promoted quietly and placed in charge of a new branch of covert operations, designed specifically to deal with domestic threats, not threats to security, but threats to narrative, people who saw too much, who asked too often, who remembered things they were told to forget. He began operating under new names, using passports issued by nations that did not exist and funding projects through shell corporations that produced nothing, sold nothing, and existed only on paper. He visited Dallas once more in 1965 under the name Henry Slate and met with a man who worked for the Dallas Medical Examiner's office. That man later told his wife he had been offered a large sum of money to misplace a fragment of bone from the autopsy. The fragment never made it into evidence and was never seen again. What Stryker knew, what he did, what he buried, will likely never be fully understood. But the trail of silence he left behind speaks louder than any confession. Every file erased, every witness vanished, every question that was never allowed to be asked forms a pattern of suppression, so precise it could only have been executed by someone who had been trained not to kill but to erase. And yet in every operation, even one as controlled as this, something slips through the cracks. A survivor, a witness, a single frame of film that escapes destruction. A reporter who will not stay silent, A voice that refuses to be forgotten. That voice would come later, but for now the silence remained, and in that silence Harold Stryker did his work. He had not been hired to solve the crime, but to make sure the truth would never be solved at all. Oswald always looked like he was chasing something that had already disappeared. His eyes held the weight of questions he was never allowed to ask, and the silence that surrounded him in the days leading to the assassination was not just quiet. It was planned. Every move he made, every place he visited, every call he took was observed, not by the press, not by his friends, not even by his enemies, but by men in black suits who moved without sound and spoke without names. The apartment he stayed in was bugged before he even stepped through the door. The woman who rented it to him said he smiled like someone who did not belong in this world. Was not a killer, he was not a hero, he was not even important till someone decided to make him important. He was a piece on a board too large to see in full, and too complex to escape. The operation that surrounded him was called Kane, and Kane did not refer to a man or a mission, but to a system. Kane stood for Controlled Asset Infiltration Node, and it had one purpose: to embed seemingly innocent figures into potentially explosive situations and trigger chaos. When the time was right, Oswald was selected not because of what he believed, but because of what he lacked. He had no tribe, no loyalty, no voice strong enough to fight back. 3 days before the president was killed, Oswald received a letter slipped under his door, sealed with no return address and no markings inside. Was a single instruction: bring the rifle to the Texas School Book Depository. Surveillance training scheduled 11:30 a.m. floor 6. The handwriting was printed clean, almost mechanical, and unsigned. Oswald had seen similar orders before. He had worked on low-level infiltration missions pretending to support pro-Castro groups while secretly feeding their names and meeting details to handlers he never met. This was different. He was told he would be training with a new team and needed to be present for a test run. No ammunition would be provided. He was assured that the weapon was a prop. It was not until this day. No evidence shows Oswald ever fired the weapon that killed the president, because the truth is, he never did. The trajectory analysis, the ballistic evidence, the sound pattern reports all indicated more than one shooter. But every time those findings surfaced, someone stepped in and changed the story, not with threats, but with edits. At 11:30, Oswald entered the building carrying the rifle in a bag that did not look like a gun case. He smiled at the receptionist and signed in with a fake name. No one questioned it. No one stopped him. By then, half the building had already been emptied of unrelated employees, all under the excuse of a fire drill that never happened elsewhere. Oswald was told to wait on the 6th floor and prepare to receive a radio call for the training simulation. The call never came. Instead, he heard a shot, and then a second, and then silence. He ran to the window, saw people scattering like ants, saw the limo speeding away, saw agents yelling and ducking, and somewhere deep inside, he realized he had just been buried alive, not in dirt, not in blood, but in lies. He tried to leave, but the door to the stairwell was jammed, blocked from the other side. A few minutes later, a plainclothes officer burst in, pointed a weapon at him, asked no questions, and then left without arresting him. Oswald ran again, this time out the back door, blending with a group of bystanders. He made it as far as a movie theater before he was found again. By that time, the orders had already gone out. Frame him, contain him, silence him. Phase 2 had been activated. Oswald was arrested not for the assassination, but for the murder of Officer J.D. Tippit, a crime he did not commit. Tippit was killed at close range in the Oak Cliff neighborhood, the same neighborhood where Oswald was said to be hiding. The timeline did not add up. The witnesses changed their stories. The autopsy was sealed, and the bullets were never matched conclusively to Oswald's weapon. In fact, the original police report listed a revolver make and model that Oswald never owned. Officer who wrote that report vanished 3 weeks later, his car found at the bottom of a river with no sign of impact and no explanation for how it got there. His family said he had been afraid of men who watched his house from across the street, afraid of a voice on the phone that told him to forget what he saw. But before he disappeared, he spoke to a reporter named Louis Kramer. Louis was new to the beat, young and reckless, and determined to find the truth. He recorded their conversation on a reel-to-reel tape and hid it in his apartment. That apartment was burglarized the next night. The only thing missing was the tape. Louis survived, but he never spoke publicly again. Years later, on his deathbed, he told his son that Oswald had been set up, and that Tippett's death was part of the same plan, a necessary diversion to give police a reason to chase and capture Oswald. Before he spoke to anyone, Oswald tried to talk. He begged for a lawyer. He shouted in the hallway, "I am a patsy." He was not lying inside the station. He was interrogated for hours with no legal counsel present. The transcripts of those sessions were destroyed. The audio was erased. Only fragments remain, notes written in the margins of a forgotten file cabinet, now in possession of a retired detective who refuses to release them out of fear, not for himself, but for his family. He says those notes reveal that Oswald named another man, a man with pale eyes and a flat voice, who had visited him days before the assassination, using the name Palmer. He said Palmer gave him instructions, then disappeared. That name does not appear in any other record. No one named Palmer was associated with Oswald. No friend, no colleague, no neighbor ever saw him. But in a different file, unearthed by a researcher 30 years later, a surveillance photo shows a man resembling Agent Harold Stryker entering the same diner Oswald used to frequent 2 days before the shooting. The timestamp matches Oswald's account, but the photo was dismissed as unrelated and filed under miscellaneous by a supervisor, who later left the agency under mysterious circumstances. The deeper you dig into the story, the clearer it becomes that Oswald was not supposed to survive. He was supposed to be killed on the spot, silenced before he could untangle the threads. But something went wrong. He made it to custody. He spoke, and that made him dangerous. That is why the next part of the story happened not in secret, but in plain view, in front of cameras and reporters, and the entire nation watching. A man walked into the police basement and fired a bullet into Oswald's chest, ending the life of the one man who could have unspooled the entire operation. But that moment belongs to the next chapter, and the man who pulled that trigger had his own orders and his own secrets. Jack Ruby was not a killer by nature. He ran a nightclub named Carousel and lived in a world of cigarette smoke, neon lights, and the false laughter of people trying to forget he owed money to dangerous men. He talked too much and trusted too little. And above all, he was not supposed to be involved in anything greater than a rigged poker game or a quiet payoff behind the kitchen. But then he got the call. A voice he did not recognize told him where to be, what time to arrive, and what to bring. And the voice made it clear that this was not a request 2 days after Kennedy was killed. Jack Ruby stood in a parking garage beneath the Dallas Police Department, surrounded by reporters and flashbulbs and uniforms. He walked calmly. He did not run. He did not look afraid. And then in a single moment he raised the gun and pulled the trigger. The shot echoed louder than the screams, louder than the sirens, louder than the truth. Oswald collapsed, his mouth opened, his eyes darted left, then right. Then nothing, just silence. Jack Ruby lowered the weapon and allowed himself to be arrested. Came next was supposed to be the end, the final punctuation mark on a story already buried under dirt and official reports. But Ruby did not behave like a man who had acted out of anger or patriotism. He behaved like a man who knew what he had done and who he had done it for. He was placed in a cell with tight security, but even walls could not stop a conscience. And soon he started to talk, not in public, but to a priest who came to visit every week. That priest later told a journalist that Ruby had confessed to being used, that he was told the country needed a scapegoat, and that Oswald was too dangerous to be left alive. Ruby said the man who called him knew things about his life that he had never spoken aloud. He said he was promised protection for his family, a clean record, and money wired to a bank account under a false name. He never received any of it. Days after his confession to the priest, Ruby collapsed during a routine medical checkup. His cause of death was listed as a pulmonary embolism, but the toxicology Report was never released, and the attending nurse who took his vitals before he died resigned without giving a statement. Her final note in the hospital log simply read, "I cannot live with this." Years past, the Warren Commission concluded that Oswald acted alone, that there was no conspiracy, that Jack Ruby acted on impulse, and yet documents continued to vanish, witnesses continued to die, and those who dug too deep found themselves looking over their shoulders. One man did not stop. His name was Benjamin Royce, a former military analyst who had served in covert intelligence before resigning to become a private researcher. Royce believed that the assassination was part of a larger pattern, one that had roots in multiple countries and included military contractors, corporate interests, and rogue elements within federal agencies. Royce uncovered something buried deep in a forgotten archive, a reel of 8mm film labeled only with a number and stored in a box marked expired. Royce viewed the reel, and what he saw changed everything. The film showed Dealey Plaza moments before and after the shots were fired. It was taken from an angle no one had seen before, possibly from a nearby building or hidden camera. It captured the moment. Kennedy was struck from the front, not the rear. His head snapped back, not forward, and a small cloud of smoke rose from behind the picket fence on the grassy knoll. In the frame, Royce froze. He saw a man step out from behind that fence. He wore gloves and carried an object shaped like a long tube. Not a rifle, not a handgun, something else, something unknown. His face was turned slightly, and his profile matched a man Royce had once seen in a briefing photo. The man was Agent Harold Stryker, the same Stryker who had cleaned up the scene, the same Stryker who had appeared in surveillance photos around foreign assassinations, the same Stryker whose name did not exist in any official database. Royce uploaded the reel to a secure server and shared it under a username called Phase 3 Initiated. Within hours it was downloaded, uploaded, and spread across anonymous forums. Seen by thousands before being removed, the original account was deleted. The server was breached. Royce himself vanished the following week. His apartment was untouched. His passport was found burned in a trash bin behind a diner, and his last message to a colleague read, "If they find me, it was never suicide." People who had seen the video knew what it meant. It meant that the story they were told was a lie. It meant that the president was not killed by a lone gunman, but by a coordinated plan executed with precision by professionals and buried by institutions designed to protect not the truth but themselves. And once you understand that, you begin to question everything else. Who gave the order? Was it a general? Was it a spy? Was it a businessman? Or was it someone elected to serve? Was it even one person? Or was it a group, a machine, a system with no face and no conscience? That question remains, and perhaps it always will. But what cannot be denied is the pattern, the fingerprints of control, the signatures of silence. The bullet may have ended one life, but it echoed through decades of history, leaving behind fear, confusion, and darkness. And yet the story does not end there. Because for every file that vanished, a copy remained. For every witness silenced, a whisper survived. For every truth buried, a new voice rose up to dig it back up. The past cannot be changed, but the present can be reclaimed. This story was never about a single shot or a single man. It was about power, the kind that hides in plain sight and moves pieces across a board while the world watches. The wrong square. Jack Ruby did not pull the trigger because he wanted to. He did it because someone made him believe he had no choice. Oswald did not kill the president because he hated him. He died because someone needed him to carry the blame and disappear. The real shooter walked away, and the real architects never left the room. They are the ones who write the history books, who dictate the news, who decide what the public is allowed to know. But now you know. Now you have seen the cracks in the story, the gaps in the timeline, the vanishing fingerprints, and the trail of broken lives that point in one direction. They say the truth sets you free, but sometimes it just shows you how deep the prison really is. And maybe the most dangerous thing you can ever do is ask the question, who pulled the trigger? Because the answer is not a name, it is a system, a machine, a shadow that reaches farther than bullets. and deeper than fear, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. This is the untold truth of the JFK assassination. And whether you believe it or not, it believes in you. It has shaped your world, your country, your future in ways you were never meant to understand. But now you do, and once a mind has been opened, it cannot be shut. The case was closed, but the crime was never solved. The pages were stamped, but the ink still runs, and somewhere in a locked room, a voice still whispers, Phase 1 is complete, and now you know why.